Hello, I'm Alexey Nikolsky, composer and musicologist with a doctorate degree from the Moscow Tchaikovsky Conservatory. This is my second video dedicated to the expressive power of pitch. In this video, I'm going to address a topic without which no discussion about the expressive aspects of music can take place. The problem to tackle here is that music is a social phenomenon, and as such, any form of music relies on its transmission from person to person. This transmission occurs both in space, from one geographic region to another, involving new people and new cultures, and in time, from one generation to another. Disruption of transmission, especially between generations, can cause the extinction of a musical tradition. For the auditory transmission to work, a listener must accurately recognize the combinations of sounds and to retrieve their corresponding semantic information. This is what we do with verbal language. The speaker and the listener have to know which combination of phonemes forms a given word, which is the signifier, and what is the meaning of that word, which is the signified. Both the word and its meaning are conserved by means of public conventions that set the boundaries for which usage of a word is normal and which is abnormal in a given sentence. Music follows the same principle. Specific patterns of musical sounds are adopted by the community of music users to convey certain expressions. The key role here is played by music genres. They attach specific music structures to specific semantic characteristics based on the most common applications of music within a given music culture. For instance, the common activity of walking to music sets the structural and semantic characteristics for marches, whereas the lulling of a baby to sleep shapes a different set of characteristics that distinguish lullabies. Any insider of a given music culture can intuitively tell which pattern characterizes a march and which a lullaby. Such conventions are implicit and irrational. They spontaneously emerge from the practice of musical communication. Different music cultures might employ slightly different characteristics, which may make it hard for an outsider to distinguish one pattern from another. So, processional music in one culture can be different from the processional music in another culture. Nevertheless, an outsider can still learn the relevant foreign conventions by observing a marching ceremony or lulling of a baby in an unfamiliar music culture, and noticing the correspondence between the characteristic musical features and the reaction of the participants. Quite similar to how a foreigner learns new words in a foreign language by observing the interaction between the speakers in a real-life situation. That is why musical expressions can be called idiomatic, like verbal idioms. People recognize specific combinations of sounds as part of a particular style or a form of expression. It is this idiomatic foundation that ensures the effective transmission of music. And by the same token, it determines what is normal and what is abnormal for music in that tradition. Just like a listener becomes confused by a wrong use of a word in a sentence, the misuse of a conventional music pattern confuses the audience. Now, a single instance of such misuse can be corrected by considering its context. A listener can figure out what the musician intended to express by relating the confusing pattern to the genre, style, performance setting, and the familiar patterns in the music. But when the number of misused musical patterns gets too large, contextual corrections become difficult, even impossible, thereby preventing communication. And when the number of people who systematically misuse or misunderstand the conventional music patterns becomes large enough, the survival of a musical tradition becomes threatened. And this is the essence of this video. It is not an overstatement to say that the entire world's music today is under threat. of the unfortunate side effects of globalization that took place in the 20th century was that the music industry, run primarily by Western corporations and staffed by people who went to Western music schools, ended up by adopting a philosophy that violates the biomusicological norms and therefore undermines the effectiveness of musical communication. But before delving into this, which I will come back to later, let me explain how the survival of Western classical music is critical for the world's most popular forms of music of today. They are based on melodic, harmonic and rhythmometric idioms that have formed within the Western classical music. Their ethnic idioms are integrated in music compositions according to the Western conventions of musical keys, meters, rhythmic divisions and music forms that were ultimately shaped during the second half of the 18th century. This transformation is most obvious in those cultures that originally differed a lot from Western classical music. For instance, the traditional music of Turkey is characterized by the complete absence of harmonic accompaniment. Here is a Turkish folk dance tune performed in a traditional style. And here is a modern arrangement of it in a Western style, with the accompaniment of chords, a prelude-like introduction, and flashy passages. Turkey was one of the first non-Western countries to adopt Western chords. Demetrius Cantemir, a Moldavian prince known as Cantemiroglu in Turkey, introduced chords in his 1704 treatise called the Book of the Science of Music Through Letters and dedicated to the Turkish Sultan Ahmed III. Similar developments occurred in many African, Latin American and Arab countries, in Middle Asia, in India, China and Japan. For instance, Japanese music education became westernized in the 19th century, accompanying the spread of Western musical instruments. And Western harmonization has now become the new norm, overshadowing the traditional Japanese harmony. In this example, you'll hear a traditional arrangement of a folk tune Sakura Sakura for two kotos. And now, listen to an arrangement of the same tune with Western chords and with a Western style introduction.
Sakura, Sakura, yayoi no sora wa.
Here, I don't mean to make a politicized claim, but the reality is that whether we like it or not, the world has embraced the principles of Western music. That is why the threat to the efficacy of music communication in Western music affects virtually all popular forms of world music. In this video, I am going to show how classical music has gradually gone off the rails from its initially normal modus operandi, which first and foremost relied on conventions of melodic expression. In my previous video, I explained what distinguishes musical tone from other sounds, and how musical pitch is the most effective means through which music communicates. I also showed that for most of the world's music cultures, musical pitch remains inherently euphonic, no matter what it expresses. There is only one exception to this biologically rooted hedonism. Unfortunately, this exception is very influential. It has a strong grip over the present-day music academia and music industry worldwide. I am talking about what started as the avant-garde music of the 20th century, which denounced the historical roots of Western classical music, along with the musical conventions that took centuries to develop. Not only that conventions are indispensable for music communication, they are present in all musical traditions of the world, and therefore enable cross-cultural communication. The reason for this is that all popular conventions rely on psychophysiological norms of processing music that are common to all humans. The advocates of avant-garde music view such conventions as retrograde, which stifle the freedom of individual creativity of composers. They believe that the evolutionary path of music is governed solely by innovation, which they consider progress, and that the main role of the composer is to keep inventing novel techniques regardless of whether the general public is capable of making sense of the innovations or not. Many avant-garde compositions were inspired by concerns for artistic truth, an ideology that subscribes to the belief that composers have a duty towards the society in which they live to truthfully reflect upon its social conditions. Living in a conflicting society, torn by wars and revolutions, according to this line of reasoning, requires conflicting and unpleasant music. Otherwise, pleasant melodies and harmonies would constitute a sweet lie, which characterizes commercial forms of music, where the music maker tries to please the customer in order to sell their music. An avant-garde artist here appears like a prophet confronting society with unpleasant truth. This philosophy was formulated by Theodor Adorno in his book on popular music, and was shared by many 20th century composers. In essence, the music was composed with the purpose to disturb the listener, and therefore it deliberately avoided coherent melodies and pleasant harmonies. This trend emerged around the 1910s, fueled by conflicts that led to World War I and became especially pronounced in Germany and Austria. A good example is Alban Berg's March, composed during his military service in 1914. It was adored by Adorno for its ferocious and chaotic monumentalism. As this anhedonic aesthetics began to gain support amongst the Western intellectuals, other composers also started to jump in, adopting the same stance of displeasing their audience, albeit for other reasons. Thus, Prokofiev and Stravinsky unleashed the dissonance to express wild, primordial energy, which in the Jungian framework of the collective unconscious was believed to lead people to commit dramatic acts. Such was a famous depiction of a barbaric sacrifice in Stravinsky's Rite of Spring that caused a riot during its premiere in 1913. By the way, just like the premiere of songs by Berg just 2 months earlier. Let me underline that Berg's and Stravinsky's music still remain expressive, since they retain many conventional idioms of rhythm, meter, texture, and music form. To be fair, not all avant-garde composers became attracted to the idea of equating tonal organization with social order and making their music deliberately disharmonious and uninhibited. Some artists even found a way to present disharmonious characters in a harmonious way, viewing them as a new order, a new kind of unusual harmony to be enjoyed. Despite Scriabin's use of dissonant combinations of sounds and avoidance of typical tonal, harmonic and melodic progressions, his music nonetheless appears harmonious and mysterious, as it implements expressive and recognizable themes. It took another lapse of deterioration before modernistic forms of music started fundamentally lacking expressivity and becoming secluded. The turning point here was the emergence of Abstractionism. Stravinsky is often credited as the father of Abstractionism for saying that music is, by its very nature, essentially powerless to express anything at all. However, in reality, Stravinsky made great efforts to have the most expressive performers premiere his compositions. He criticized those performers who played his works not expressive enough and conducted his own works expressively. In light of this, his statements about the supposed emotionality of music come as a disingenuous attempt of scandalous self-promotion by means of negating the ABCs of the very occupation of the Western classical composer. The actual pioneer of the abstractionist approach to music was Anton Webern. In stark contrast to Stravinsky, Webern never claimed that music is fundamentally inexpressive. Yet in his music, except a handful of his first compositions, he did everything to disperse harmonic tension and achieve a peculiar blissed state, free of human passions and conflicts. Webern began as a faithful Schoenberg's disciple, but quickly abandoned the idea of using disharmony to express tension and conflict. He departed from his mentor by rejecting the usage of conventional rhythm and meter. Because of this, his music doesn't generate musical movement and waves of climax, unlike Schoenberg's music that remains a lot more conventional and emotional, despite completely missing consonant harmony, like our earlier Berg's example. Anton Webern pioneered the tendency to abstain from musical communication in favor of the ivory tower of abstractionism. This is most evident in his vocal music, since it uses lyrics. Listen to this movement from his Cantata No. 2, where the lyrics say, "The world is filled with the bliss of friendship and asks for our love." Now look for anything in the music that even slightly resembles the expression of bliss, friendship, or love. Webern's music sounds shattered in small disconnected fragments, refined in some peculiar manner, but devoid of any specific expression, more like an abstract sound design, rather than an expression intended to make the audience feel a certain way. Starting from Webern, avant-garde composers became primarily concerned with the technique of arranging sounds, and disinterested in how this made the listeners feel. Webern's music is often described as pointillistic, It appears as a nexus of disconnected pitches evenly distributed within a particular range of frequency and time. Very much like pointillist painters such as Seurat, who filled up their paintings with discrete colored dots. But unlike Seurat, who used this technique to depict conventional objects, Webern chose to go completely abstract, closer to his favorite painter Mondrian, whose paintings require special attention from the museum curators to make sure that they are not accidentally hung upside down. Likewise, music of experimentalists like Webern must be guarded against performance mistakes, which are hard to catch even for the composer of the music. And here I'm not exaggerating. A Belgian cognitive scientist, Dirk Mollens, compared multiple performances of an avant-garde composition by Karel Goeyvaerts, one of the Darmstadt composers, most creatively titled Number 1. This composition went into history as the first to implement the technique of total serialism. On this 1951 recording, you can hear Goeyvaerts and his adamant follower Stockhausen, who later became an avant-garde celebrity, together performing this work for Adorno, who often presided over the Darmstadt classes. Other than the fact that even to Adorno's ear, the Goeyvaerts opus rightfully appeared as a meaningless assortment of sounds, and Stockhausen's defense of it that the absence of meaning was intended by the author for some philosophical reasons. There is even a more entertaining twist to this story. Mollens found 23 errors in this performance, some of which were as severe as the performers going off by 3 beats. Had anything like this happened in, say, a performance of Bach, Mozart or Beethoven, it would have been considered a huge disgrace and gravely frowned upon. But Goeyvaerts considered his performance of his own music exemplary. What's even more hilarious is that he publicly criticized the 1974 performance of the same composition produced by the Belgian National Radio for having had too many mistakes, whereas in reality it contained twice fewer errors than his own 1951 performance. In fact, this 1974 performance was the most accurate of all the recordings that Mollens had analyzed. Failure to detect so many pronounced mistakes in one's own music indicates that the composer did not conceive it in a traditional way, that is, by imagining the most suitable sound for what they wanted to express, and then to write it down. But who am I to talk? After all, I only studied music for 20 years in the best music schools. Avant-garde composers were the first to invent and adopt the new method of scribbling some notes on paper and then entertaining themselves by discovering how these notes actually sounded when played on a musical instrument. John Cage brags about this in his books. Needless to say, such a compositional method is designed to explicitly not convey any ideas. Schoenberg was totally right when he told Cage, who wanted to study composition under him at UCLA during the World War II, that Cage was not a composer, but an inventor in his mindset. Being able to imagine music of a specific type in mind is one of the staples of the traditional occupation of a composer. The truth of the matter is that, unfortunately, all such revolutionary compositional techniques attracted young composers, as it provided them with a reason not to compete with the standards established by the earlier masters. It is hard to match Beethoven, Bach, or Chopin's mastery of expression, so why not to declare them outdated and instead just scribble down some strange but original combinations of sounds and pronounce it a faithful representation of a new reality or a new vision of the world. After all, it's more impressive to be named the founder of a new way of expression. During World War II and the Cold War, such artists found generous sponsorship by the US government. I'll cover this in a separate video. And the most powerful philanthropic organizations to promote freedom of expression under the umbrella of abstract expressionism against the convention-based music of the Nazis and the communists. Unfortunately, this campaign didn't end with the end of the Cold War, when the communist regimes gave up and succumbed to the avant-garde ideology. The entire establishment of music education, music criticism and philanthropy for almost a century has strived to teach the public to appreciate abstract experimental music, in spite of its fundamental incomprehensibility and unpleasantness. However, despite all their wasted efforts, almost all audiences continue to enjoy the music of the great masters of the past and at best respectfully tolerate the new unconventional music. The best proof of this is the widespread practice of programming recitals where a modern music composition of such kind is sandwiched in between two of the beloved evergreens that had brought in the audience. Or just pick any classical music radio station or streaming service and count the number of modern abstract works against the works of the old masters. And as far as the new popular songs and film music of today goes, they continue to abide by the traditional conventions and stay hedonistic. As a side effect of the dominance of Western corporations in the global market, the whole economy of the classical music industry was turned topsy-turvy. Those Western composers who remained faithful to conventional forms of expression now had to compete against those composers who were generously supported by the establishment. When the West started winning the Cold War and direct governmental involvement was withdrawn, a plethora of philanthropic organizations took over. These organizations were run by the same people who previously ran governmental programs of psychological warfare with the Communist East. They simply kept doing what they were already used to doing, without understanding what music actually is, what is normal for it to work, and what are the ramifications of disrupting its normal modus operandi. Of all aspects of musical expression that have to do with pitch, melody is by far the most hedonistic. Harmony often deliberately engages unpleasant combinations of sounds, called dissonance, in order to generate tension, so that it can then be resolved into consonance. In fact, the very term melody implies concordance of sounds. The ancient Greek word melos means chanting, and in order to chant, people must agree on which combinations of tones sound good together. It was the necessity to define such criteria that motivated Plato to lay down the principles of what he called melopeia, the art of creating good melody, which set the foundation for Western classical music as well as the traditional music of the entire Middle East area. And the principal criterion of such goodness was ethos, The doctrine that assumed the psycho-emotional power of specific melodic modes to influence individuals and the society at large. Hence, the science of melopeia was supposed to serve the communication of important emotional information to the audience. Here is the oldest surviving excerpt of ancient Greek music, the first chorus by Euripides from his tragedy Orestes, created in 408 BC. It is pretty obvious that the melody here serves as the principal means of expressing the character of the drama. In the lyrics, Orestes is singing, "I cry, lament so much." The rhythm remains basic, and there are no chords in the essentially monophonic music. Such arrangement characterizes all Middle Eastern musical traditions, from Morocco to India. Western classical music also remained monophonic and melody dominant up until somewhere around the 12th century. And the earliest forms of multi-part music were all melody based. They either dubbed the principal melody, imitated it, or juxtaposed it with two or more other melodies. The first use of chords to accompany melody came during the Renaissance, and still, theory of classical composition held melodic expression as primary. This is how Johann Kirnberger, the pupil of Johann Sebastian Bach, characterized melody in his influential treatise The Art of Strict Musical Composition, published in 1771. He says, "The true goal of music, its proper enterprise, is melody. All the parts of harmony have as their ultimate purpose only beautiful melody. Therefore, the question of which is more significant, melody or harmony, is futile. Beyond doubt, the means is subordinate to the end." To sum things up, if a music culture is to survive, the normal way for it would be to maintain communication between musicians and the audience by means of idiomatic patterns of melody. The way this happens is that usually musicians explicitly learn a stock of the most common patterns and actively use them in making music, while audiences learn them implicitly and passively by recognizing and appreciating the familiar patterns. In folk music cultures, audiences and musicians are the same. Practically every member of a music community participates in producing and consuming music. In contrast, in music cultures that have formal music theory and notation, a large share of the population consumes music only passively, and active music making is delegated to a small group of trained musicians, usually professional. Western classical music is unique in distinguishing between composers, performers, and listeners, where many members of these three groups do not mix, meaning that there are listeners who don't play music, composers who don't perform, and performers who don't compose. Such segregation complicates the transmission of music and imposes a greater challenge on performers to perform expressively enough so that the listeners can grasp their intentions. The problem here is that the listener's passive competence is inferior to the musician's active competence. So listeners are the weakest link in the transmission chain. If the majority of listeners stop grasping the meaning of musical expressions, the entire transmission code becomes compromised and therefore can no longer secure the survival of that music culture. Unfortunately, this is exactly what happened in the 20th century. Looking for a shortcut to avoid competing with the masters of the past, by the time of the World War I, young composers took on the rhetoric of innovation and progressivism to justify their permanent revolution in discarding the conventional means of expression and replacing them with their own inventions. Many took on the marketing strategy of generating scandals with the premiere of their groundbreaking compositions and to unleash public polemics with their critics. The success of the earliest revolutionaries, such as Stravinsky, in earning a place in the Hall of Fame next to the earlier masters, inspired generations of composers that followed. And when World War II erupted, music became part of psychological warfare. The UK and US governments bid on the avant-garde ideology to weaponize freedom of individual artistic expression in the psychological warfare against the Nazi and communist governments that promoted collective forms of expression that relied on conventions. The victory, at first over the Nazi and then over the Soviet bloc, consolidated the grip of the West over the global music industry. As a result of intense westernization, all the world's music cultures became affected by the Western radicalization of originality, which disregarded conventions of the past. The resulting erosion of the conventional basis of music has reduced and continues to reduce people's appreciation of music. The most avid innovators are disinterested in how the public perceives their work, since they gain financial support not from the audience, but from bureaucratic organizations that entrust a handful of gatekeepers with the decision to choose which innovations deserve promotion and funding. Making such decisions on behalf of the public is justified by deeming the public ignorant and unrefined, since after an entire century of vigorous promotion of the avant-garde values, people still enjoy music that bears the conventional expressive means of the past. Here, I'm going to quote my mentor, Edison Denisov. Initially an avid participant and proponent of the Darmstadt school and the leader of the avant-garde movement against the conventional communist music in the USSR, Denisov revised his position in the late 1980s. In his own words, "In composition, there is not a single outdated expressive device. It is only the aesthetics that becomes outdated. No expressive means should be dismissed as old-fashioned. Any conventional device can turn out to be not only useful, but in fact essential for certain expressive purposes. If you want to find your own way, before anything else, you must master every technique that has existed before you, even those that are considered dead, for instance, strict polyphony or even earlier. One of the biggest defects of modernist music is its ignorance of melodic expression." So, all in all, the cornerstones of world's music, its hedonistic foundation, melodic orientation, and conventional idioms have been consistently undermined by the modern-day music industry and academia. To be fair, at the time, the advocates of modernism in music simply had no way of knowing that, for instance, human infants can distinguish the sound of music from other sounds and show their preference for music sounds through displaying their enjoyment of it. That is why throughout most of the 20th century, intellectuals were confused by all talks on progress and innovation in music and the lack of information about the biological and psychoacoustic determinants of music perception. But now, with all the available knowledge at hand, it's time to put an end to all the anti-conventionalist dogmas. Let's restore music's integrity and purpose to express and to communicate. In my next video, I will show how music composition, performance, and public appreciation of both popular and serious forms of music have all deteriorated, and will propose ways to stop this downfall and help music regain its normal state. If you want to learn more about all sorts of related things about music, subscribe to my channel and don't forget to click the like button. See you next time. Bye bye.